The Windsor Ceremonial reception was supposed to be measured, formal, almost untouchable. Then one private disclosure shattered the calm. Prince Andrew had barely settled into the evening when senior members of the household learned that his presence at the reception had triggered an explosive internal discussion about his future access to royal ceremonial life. Within minutes, conversations stopped, expressions hardened, and one question dominated the room: who had authorized him to be there? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles received the warning quietly, but the silence around him changed immediately. The Windsor Ceremonial Reception, a fictional formal gathering bringing together senior royals, household officials, decorated guests, and selected members of the wider family, carried unusual symbolic weight because attendance could easily be interpreted as royal approval. Andrew's presence therefore meant more than simply appearing at a family event. To some inside the household, it risked suggesting that boundaries around his ceremonial role were beginning to soften. The king lowered his glass and asked the aide beside him one question: who signed off on this? No answer came quickly enough. Charles placed the glass down, looked directly at the official, and repeated the words more slowly. His reaction was not explosive anger. It was something colder. He wanted to know whether the arrangement had been approved deliberately, or whether someone had quietly moved around restrictions already established inside his household. Andrew sensed the change before anyone confronted him. Two courtiers who had been speaking warmly with him stepped away, and the Duke immediately became defensive. He had entered believing his presence was accepted. Now he could feel that acceptance collapsing around him. The sudden distance mattered, because he understood better than anyone that ceremonial visibility could be mistaken for rehabilitation, and he knew how fiercely some members of the family opposed that interpretation. William then received the information that made the situation far more dangerous. A senior aide told the prince that the reception itself was not the real issue. According to a confidential internal briefing, Andrew's inclusion appeared to have bypassed an earlier restriction governing ceremonial invitations. That restriction, meaning a private household rule limiting who could be placed in events carrying official royal symbolism, had reportedly been created specifically to avoid any suggestion that the Duke was returning to formal standing. The future king understood the implications immediately. The leaked account stated that the briefing had warned against placing Andrew in settings that could be interpreted as restoration. Yet somehow, his name had still appeared on the evening's arrangement. Charles now faced a brutal choice. He could protect his brother from immediate humiliation, or he could draw a boundary so unmistakable that Andrew would finally understand his former royal position was gone. But before Charles could decide what to do with the information, the deeper personal history between the three men began pressing into the room, and suddenly, this was no longer about one reception. Behind the protocol stood something far more painful than a guest list. Charles was looking at his brother. William was looking at a threat to the boundaries he believed had already been settled. Andrew was looking at a family that once placed him near the center of royal life, and now seemed determined to keep him permanently outside it. The reception had exposed a conflict no ceremony could disguise. Prince Andrew had spent much of his life inside the machinery of royal relevance, where ceremonial invitations, public placement, and access to major family occasions were never merely social privileges. They signaled standing. Losing those privileges meant losing part of the identity he had once taken for granted. That was why every disputed appearance carried such emotional force for him. What others saw as sensible distance, he increasingly experienced as a reminder that the life he once knew was no longer waiting for him. William saw the same situation through an entirely different lens. The Prince of Wales, the title held by the monarch's senior heir and future king, had become increasingly focused on removing ambiguity from royal boundaries. To him, uncertainty was dangerous. If Andrew appeared repeatedly at events carrying formal symbolism, the public could easily interpret that visibility as a quiet reversal of earlier decisions. The future king believed the institution could not survive by saying one thing privately while suggesting another through ceremony. Charles felt trapped between those two realities. The king understood William's concern, but he also understood the humiliation his brother would feel if corrected publicly. Andrew was still family. Yet family loyalty could not automatically restore institutional standing. That contradiction left the monarch trying to protect both the crown and a sibling who increasingly believed the crown itself had turned against him. Andrew vented his frustration privately to a longtime aide. He complained that every appearance was treated as though he had arrived to provoke the family deliberately. The Duke insisted that attending a reception should not automatically be read as an attempt to reclaim an official role. But even as he said it, he knew the atmosphere around him suggested the family no longer trusted appearances to remain just appearances. William then received the detail that transformed suspicion into alarm. The disputed invitation had not appeared by accident. According to a documented account from the ceremonial planning process, Andrew's name had initially been omitted and was later deliberately restored. Even more troubling, Charles was told the change had happened without full approval from his senior private office. The possibility was explosive. Someone had not merely made a mistake. Someone may have been testing how far Andrew could be reintroduced before resistance began. Andrew finally asked one longtime courtier whether William had ordered the change. The man hesitated for several seconds before answering. This did not begin with the Prince of Wales. That answer changed everything, because the road to the reception had begun weeks earlier, with one small ceremonial decision that nobody understood would become the point of no return. Weeks before anyone whispered at the Windsor reception, a smaller moment had already set the crisis in motion. It happened during preparations for a private royal commemorative service. Andrew had asked a question that sounded harmless. Would he be permitted to join the family's formal arrival? The answer given that afternoon would later be remembered inside the household as the moment every boundary began to blur. Prince Andrew had been allowed to attend family occasions privately, but planners were working carefully to separate personal presence from official royal participation. That distinction mattered because entrances, seating positions, processional order, and receiving lines could all signal status. A formal procession, meaning the arranged order in which royals enter or move together during a ceremonial event, could make someone appear to be acting in an official capacity even when no such role had formally been restored. Andrew tested that boundary during preparations for the fictional St. George's commemorative service. He asked a senior equerry whether he could join the family's formal arrival instead of entering separately. An equerry is a senior royal aide who assists with official engagements and ceremonial arrangements. The request was tentatively approved, and for a brief moment, the Duke believed something important had shifted. William's office objected almost immediately. The reversal hit Andrew harder than he expected. He later confronted Charles during a private family conversation and admitted that he could accept losing formal duties, but he could not accept being treated as though his presence itself had become embarrassing. The Duke told his brother that every restriction now seemed designed not simply to limit his role, but to remind him publicly that the family no longer trusted him near the center of royal life. Charles sympathized, but the king refused to overturn the decision. He told Andrew that family membership and public royal standing had become two different things. The monarch understood how painful that sounded, yet he also believed ambiguity could damage the institution. His brother heard only the finality of the boundary. Charles eventually closed the folder between them and said quietly, "I cannot make every room feel as it did before." Andrew did not answer. The conversation should have ended the issue. Instead, it created a dangerous compromise. According to a documented internal account in this dramatized narrative, one household official later instructed event planners to avoid unnecessary public confrontations by giving Andrew greater flexibility at private ceremonial gatherings. The phrase was vague enough to mean almost anything. Weeks later, Windsor planners received that instruction. Someone interpreted flexibility as permission. That interpretation placed Andrew back inside an environment carrying official royal symbolism, and when the old wound finally reopened at Windsor, He did not retreat, he confronted the person he believed had been tightening the boundaries all along. The confrontation came without shouting. That made it worse. Andrew waited until the formalities loosened, approached William away from the main reception line, and asked one devastating question. "Was this your doing?" The Prince of Wales knew exactly what he meant. For several seconds neither man moved. Around them, conversation continued, but between uncle and nephew, a years-old argument had finally become impossible to avoid. Prince Andrew had come to see William as the person most determined to draw hard lines around his remaining royal presence. The future king believed private family ties and official representation had to be kept separate, especially when public appearances could be mistaken for restored duties. Andrew saw that same policy very differently. To him, the repeated restrictions felt less like institutional caution and more like a slow effort to erase him from ceremonial life altogether. Andrew accused his nephew of pushing that process further than anyone else. He said limiting duties was one thing, but repeatedly removing him from formal arrangements sent another message entirely. William did not raise his voice. The prince told him the issue was not punishment, it was clarity. If someone appeared in groupings that resembled official service, the public would naturally assume the institution was signaling a return. William then explained why he had objected to the reception grouping. He had learned that an earlier planning restriction had been bypassed, and that discovery changed everything. The prince said he had not intervened simply because Andrew was present. He intervened because the arrangement made it appear as though a settled boundary had quietly disappeared. Andrew stepped closer. "Do you want me completely absent from royal ceremonies?" he asked. William held his ground. "I want everyone to know what role they are actually performing." The answer landed hard. Andrew argued that being repeatedly separated carried symbolism of its own. Every different entrance, every altered seating position, every exclusion from a formal grouping told the world something too. The Duke insisted that the family could not claim these details were meaningless when they used the same details to define status. William understood the point, but he refused to surrender the principle. Then he gave his uncle the information that shifted the confrontation in an entirely new direction. Charles had already been warned. According to a private briefing shared with William before the reception, the king had been told days earlier that Andrew's inclusion created a conflict with the existing restrictions. Yet Charles had delayed a final decision, apparently hoping the issue could be resolved without another family confrontation. Andrew went silent. For all his anger toward William, he had believed his brother was the one person quietly trying to protect him from further humiliation. Now he realized Charles had known the problem was coming and had allowed the uncertainty to survive. William's answer hurt, but the discovery that Charles had known beforehand cut deeper, because now Andrew wanted an explanation from the one person who could no longer hide behind protocol. By the middle of the evening, the argument had reached the king. Charles could no longer treat the situation as a misunderstanding between planners, brothers, or generations. Every possible choice carried a cost. Allow Andrew to remain inside ceremonial arrangements, and the palace risked sending one message. Remove him abruptly, and a family fracture would become impossible to conceal. The monarch finally had to decide which pain he was willing to accept. Charles understood that the final responsibility rested with him. Within this fictional narrative, the sovereign's household, the senior staff operating under the monarch's authority, controlled the ceremonial composition of the reception, including official positioning, receiving lines, processions, and representational roles. William could advise, he could object, but the king carried the heavier burden because Andrew was not simply another royal figure being managed, he was his brother. The tension became personal when Charles admitted privately to a senior aide that he hated watching Andrew reduced to an administrative problem. The monarch remembered the family history underneath every briefing note and every restriction. Yet he also knew affection could not be allowed to create uncertainty around official standing. If one exception blurred the boundary, every future appearance could reopen the same argument. Camilla saw the strain immediately. The queen consort told him quietly that delaying the decision was already becoming a decision of its own. Charles did not argue. He knew she was right. Every hour of uncertainty allowed planners, courtiers, and family members to interpret the rules differently, and every different interpretation increased the chance of another public contradiction. Charles finally ordered a complete written review of Andrew's ceremonial access. The king instructed aides to separate purely private family invitations from events involving formal placement, receiving lines, processions, or representational duties. A written review, in simple terms, meant that every future appearance would be examined against clear rules rather than left to informal judgment. The monarch went further. Charles insisted that no future exception could be created through a quiet conversation, a verbal assurance, or a sympathetic interpretation from one official. Any ceremonial inclusion involving Andrew would now require central documentation and formal clearance from the king's senior private office. The loophole that had allowed the Windsor confusion to happen was being closed in real time. Charles signed the instruction, left the pen on the table, and looked toward his private secretary. No more ambiguity. Camilla understood immediately what those words meant. William would finally have the clarity he had demanded. But Andrew was about to experience that clarity as something far more painful. Proof that the flexibility he believed still existed had disappeared. The decision was only one sentence on paper, but when its consequences reached Andrew, the emotional cost became brutally real. Andrew did not receive the decision through a grand announcement. He learned through a change in movement. An aide approached before the reception's closing ceremonial sequence and quietly informed him that he would leave with the private family party rather than participate in the formal departure. Nothing had been shouted, nothing had been announced, yet Andrew understood instantly what it meant. The boundary he had spent months resisting had just become official. Prince Andrew stared at the aide for a moment, before asking whether Charles had personally approved the change. The answer came quietly, yes. The Duke's first reaction was disbelief, but the anger never fully arrived. Instead, disappointment settled in. The distinction was now unmistakable. Private family inclusion meant he could still attend as a relative, while formal ceremonial participation meant representing the monarchy in an official capacity. He was being allowed the first and denied the second. Charles watched the consequences unfold without moving to stop them. The king saw his brother step away from the formal grouping and understood exactly how humiliating the moment would feel. Yet intervention would have destroyed the clarity he had just created. His restraint became one of the most painful decisions of the evening because the monarch was not watching a stranger lose status. He was watching someone he had known his entire life realize that an old chapter had closed. Andrew asked whether the change applied only to Windsor. The aide answered that it did not. According to the written instruction issued that evening, the same distinction would now govern future ceremonial appearances across the royal calendar. Planning notes would be revised, so his attendance could no longer be interpreted as a return to representative royal status. The Duke understood then that this was not damage control for one reception. It was policy. William learned the full scope moments later and was surprised by how far his father had gone. The prince had demanded clarity, but Charles had created something stronger, a permanent approval process requiring central authorization before Andrew could be included in any event carrying official ceremonial symbolism. Informal exceptions were effectively over. What had once depended on interpretation would now depend on documentation. Andrew reached toward the ceremonial departure arrangement and removed his place card. He held it for several seconds, then handed it silently back to the aide. No protest, no argument. The gesture said more than anger could have. Charles saw it. Before his brother could leave Windsor, the king sent a private message asking him to stay behind for one final conversation. No courtiers, no planners, no institutional language. That small gesture might have ended the night in bitterness, but Charles was not prepared to let his brother walk away without hearing the truth directly from him. For the first time that evening, There were no courtiers, no schedules, and no ceremonial language protecting either man. Charles asked Andrew to remain behind for a private conversation. The door closed. The king spoke first, but not as monarch. He told his brother that the decision was his. No advisor would carry the blame. No nephew would be used as a shield. If Andrew wanted someone to resent, Charles told him, "Resent me." Prince Andrew listened without interrupting. The conflict had finally been stripped of ceremony, leaving only two brothers confronting what family loyalty could and could not survive. Charles explained that private family inclusion would continue where appropriate, but official royal standing was different. That distinction mattered because family events could express personal connection, while ceremonial appearances could suggest public representation on behalf of the crown. The monarch could preserve the first without pretending the second still existed. Andrew finally asked the question Charles had been dreading. "Are you ashamed of me?" The Duke did not sound angry. He sounded wounded. The king paused because any careless answer would turn an institutional boundary into a permanent family judgment. He told his brother the decision was not about shame. It was about refusing to pretend nothing had changed when both of them knew that it had. Charles admitted that protecting Andrew from every painful consequence would only create another kind of dishonesty. The monarch could not use affection to recreate an old reality that no longer existed. His brother looked away and asked whether the family had understood what those appearances meant to him. Andrew then revealed something Charles had never fully grasped. In that private conversation, the Duke admitted he had treated every ceremonial invitation as a possible step back toward acceptance. Every procession, every formal placement, every appearance beside senior royals had felt like evidence that the distance might be temporary. What the household saw as family accommodation, he had seen as gradual restoration. The admission changed the king's understanding immediately. Charles answered with painful clarity. There would be no quiet route back through ceremonial appearances. No sequence of invitations would slowly restore an official role without a formal decision. The ambiguity that had allowed Andrew to hope one thing while the institution intended another had to end. Andrew looked directly at his brother. "So this is permanent?" Charles paused. "The boundary is." The answer hurt, but this time the Duke did not argue. He finally understood what had changed, and, more importantly, what had not. He remained a brother. He remained family. But ceremonial access would no longer be allowed to carry a meaning the monarchy had no intention of honoring. Inside Windsor, the brothers had reached a painful understanding. Outside its walls, the story was only beginning to explode. By morning, a private family reckoning had become public drama. The leaked account moved rapidly through broadcasters, royal correspondents, and newspaper desks, transforming one tense reception into a national argument about Andrew's place inside the monarchy. But amid the headlines and analysis, one detail dominated everything else. Charles himself had drawn the boundary. For the public, that turned an awkward evening into something far more consequential. Broadcasters framed the fictional leak as evidence that the palace was tightening the distinction between family membership and formal royal duty. That distinction mattered because being invited as a relative was not the same as representing the crown in an official capacity. Commentators quickly understood that the real story was no longer Andrew's attendance at one reception. It was the new approval process personally authorized by Charles, designed to prevent private flexibility from being mistaken for institutional restoration. Prince Andrew watched the coverage privately and felt the night being rewritten around him. The Duke heard commentators describe Windsor as a decisive rejection, yet he knew the conversation with his brother had been far more complicated. Charles had not erased him from the family. He had drawn a boundary around public role and ceremonial meaning. But television debate had little patience for that difference. The story had become simpler, harsher, and far easier to package. William felt no sense of victory. The prince told Catherine privately that public vindication did not make the family consequences easier. She understood immediately. The future king had wanted clarity, because ambiguity threatened the institution. but enforcing that clarity had still wounded people he knew personally. Catherine reminded him that necessary decisions could still carry grief. He agreed, and neither treated the headlines as proof that anyone had won. The noise intensified when a fictional morning edition of the Crown Chronicle ran the headline, "The Line is Drawn," above Windsor Castle. A television presenter described the reception as, "the night the palace finally separated family from duty." The phrase spread quickly because it captured the argument in one sentence, even if it could not capture the pain behind it. Andrew turned off the television halfway through a panel discussion. He sat in silence and did not switch it back on. Palace aides refused to dispute the central substance of the ceremonial access changes. They would not confirm private conversations, but they allowed the new boundary to stand without dragging Charles and Andrew's personal exchange into an official public battle. That silence spoke loudly enough. As the frenzy began to settle, the deeper meaning became harder to ignore. This was never only about one embarrassing reception. It was about what kind of monarchy Charles and William intended to leave behind. The headlines made the night look like a victory and a defeat. The truth was harder. Everyone involved had lost something, but the monarchy had finally chosen clarity. When the noise finally settled, Windsor's ceremonial reception was remembered not for the speeches, the guests, or the formalities that had brought everyone together. It was remembered for a boundary. Andrew arrived believing there might still be room to slowly reclaim a place within royal ceremony. Charles entered, hoping family affection and institutional caution could somehow coexist without confrontation. William believed ambiguity had already become too dangerous. By the end of the night, all three knew exactly where they stood. Charles allowed the decision made at Windsor to become the lasting rule within this fictional narrative. Prince Andrew would remain part of the family, but he would no longer be included in ceremonial arrangements that could suggest official royal representation unless the sovereign explicitly changed that position. That distinction mattered because family membership described a private relationship, while royal representation meant appearing on behalf of the monarchy itself. For years, those two ideas had been allowed to overlap just enough to create confusion. Windsor finally separated them. William no longer needed to fight the same argument, event by event. The prince had spent months worrying that one exception would create expectations for the next appearance, followed by another confrontation when those expectations were denied. Charles's new framework ended that cycle. Future planners would now know exactly what required approval, and the future king could stop treating every ceremonial invitation as another test of where the institution stood. Andrew faced the hardest truth of all. The Duke finally understood that formal invitations would no longer serve as quiet steps back toward his former status. That realization hurt, because he had interpreted each appearance as evidence that acceptance might eventually become restoration. Now there was no room for that hope. Yet the clarity also ended something crueler: the repeated rise of expectation followed by public disappointment. Charles accepted his own painful lesson without celebration. The king had delayed because he loved his brother and wanted to avoid humiliating him. But leadership had finally required something affection could not soften. He had to disappoint someone he loved, because refusing to decide had only prolonged the damage. The most important revelation from Windsor was not a secret document or a hidden accusation. It was the discovery that the family had been living with two incompatible interpretations of Andrew's future. The Duke saw ceremonial inclusion as a possible path back. The institution saw it only as limited family accommodation. Charles finally forced those two meanings into one. William emerged neither triumphant nor vindictive. His insistence on clarity became part of a broader generational shift toward a smaller monarchy, where family connection would no longer automatically guarantee public ceremonial privilege. The change was not dramatic because it was cruel. It was dramatic because it was final. Andrew and Charles exchanged one brief goodbye before leaving Windsor. The king touched his brother's arm. The Duke nodded once. There was no argument, no promise, and no suggestion that the boundary would disappear. Both men understood. The monarchy had chosen definition over ambiguity, duty over nostalgia, and painful certainty over comforting confusion. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.